They were warned never to speak of it again. But one girl, barely 16, kept a hidden journal. Her final entry read, "There's something buried beneath the chapel and it's still breathing. You were never meant to hear what I'm about to tell you. Not because it's unbelievable, but because it's real. Hundreds of people have vanished from a single place in Kentucky over the span of 26 years. Not runaways, not drifters. These were men, women, and children, swallowed by a community praised for its peace, its purity, its piety. You've heard whispers, maybe, of Pleasant Hill, of the Shakers, of the miracle community that lived without money, without violence, without sin. But what you haven't heard, what they made sure you'd never hear, is what they built beneath that holiness and the price they paid to keep it alive. This isn't just about a cult or religion gone wrong. It's about something much deeper. How power hides itself in robes of light. How psychological control can turn virtue into a weapon. How one family used the promise of heaven to create a prison of the soul, and how they erased anyone who saw through the illusion. You'll hear about the Richardsons, those smiling saints with scripture in their mouths and blood on their hands. You'll see how their influence infected every room, every rule, every thought. This wasn't just manipulation. It was a system, a machine, a design so precise that it turned free men into spiritual hostages without a single chain. But I need to warn you, once you hear what happened, you won't be able to forget it. You'll look at every institution differently, every smiling leader, every perfect community. Because Pleasant Hill was an anomaly. It was a mirror, showing us what can happen when belief is weaponized and silence is bought with fear. So ask yourself now, before we go any further, are you ready to see what lies beneath the chapel? Are you ready to question what you've been told your whole life about faith, purity, and truth? Because what follows isn't history. It's a map out of the dream they built to keep you asleep. If you're still with me, then good. But don't just watch. Listen, feel, and remember, the people who disappeared at Pleasant Hill never expected anyone would come looking. By 1813, Pleasant Hill was hailed across Kentucky as a divine miracle, a community where no one owned anything, yet no one went without, where conflict had vanished, where silence meant serenity and obedience was called enlightenment. But beneath the hymns and handshakes, something darker pulsed. At the center of this illusion stood Elder Samuel Richardson, cloaked in humility but radiating absolute control. To the outside world, he was a man of God, stoic, generous, full of divine insight. Inside the gates, however, he was something else, a conductor of psychological conditioning so refined, most never realized they'd been broken. New members were told they'd be cleansed of worldly influence, but what that meant was far more invasive. Hair was shaved, letters burned, old names replaced. You didn't arrive at Pleasant Hill. You were erased into it. No past, no family, only the work, only the community, only the word as interpreted by the Richardson family. Sister Martha, Samuel's wife, was the invisible architect behind this transformation. While Samuel preached, she listened. She knew each member's doubts, wounds, secret longings. She used them as levers. If a convert missed her former life, she whispered it was temptation. If they asked too many questions, she offered prayer and then isolation. Her words were honey-laced venom, delivered with a mother's smile. Everything was calculated. You didn't eat until your repentance was acknowledged. You didn't sleep in your usual bed if your faith was suspect. You didn't speak unless spoken to. And if you did, Brother Caleb was watching, always watching. It wasn't violence that ruled Pleasant Hill. It was controlled perception. The moment you began to question, you were already in danger, not just of being punished, but of being forgotten. The Richardsons understood what modern regimes would only perfect centuries later, that true tyranny does require chains, just belief systems that bind tighter than steel. Visitors never saw it. They saw smiling faces and handmade garments, fresh bread from sacred ovens, children singing hymns under blue skies. But no one noticed that the children never cried, that no one laughed too loud, that every movement was choreographed like a ritual. One man called it heaven on earth. But that's because he didn't see what was underneath. The tunnels, the locked rooms, The cries swallowed by stone. The first to truly notice was a 9-year-old girl named Eliza. She saw something she shouldn't have seen. She told her mother. The next morning, neither of them came to breakfast, and no one ever mentioned their names again. Eliza Taylor had only been at Pleasant Hill for 6 weeks when she vanished. She wasn't sick. She wasn't weak. She hadn't broken any rules. Her mother, Margaret, a widowed schoolteacher from Lexington, had brought her to community after claiming a vision during a revival meeting. But something had shifted in Eliza since their arrival, something the Richardsons noticed almost immediately. Unlike other children, Eliza didn't respond to the indoctrination. She asked questions. Too many. Why don't we ever leave? Why do the grown-ups look afraid when they sing? Why do we all have pretend to be happy all the time? Her questions were harmless at first. Cute, even. But then she began to observe. She noticed how certain members disappeared for days at a time and returned changed, quiet, hollow-eyed, spiritually renewed. She saw Brother Caleb enter the East dormitory basement at night, carrying crates he never brought back up. And once, while helping Sister Hannah in the kitchen, Eliza opened the wrong cabinet and found a row of glass vials labeled only with numbers and one with a name, Brother Thomas. That night, she told her mother everything. Margaret's face drained of color. Not fear, recognition. It was clear now. The strict schedules, the strange tea, the whispers during evening prayer. Pleasant Hill wasn't a refuge. It was a controlled ecosystem, and Eliza had broken the containment. They planned to leave the next morning. Quietly, Margaret even packed a small bag under her bed, something strictly forbidden. But when the sun rose, neither Eliza nor Margaret were seen again. When Sister Rebecca was asked where they'd gone, she smiled and said, "The Lord has called them to deeper service elsewhere." No questions were asked, because everyone at Pleasant Hill knew what deeper service meant. That week, their quarters were reassigned, their names removed from the attendance roll, their few personal effects completely burned. But what the Richardsons didn't know was that Eliza had left something behind. A tiny hand-stitched journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the women's dormitory, barely legible in places, but chillingly precise in others. It spoke of voices in the walls, of a room beneath the chapel where children were taken for tests of spirit, of a list, names, dates, initials, 23 names, all members who had transferred to other communities, all names later found carved into the underside of a chapel bench, barely visible unless you were looking for them. All names the state of Kentucky has never acknowledged. Comment, they were never missing, just hidden, twice below if you're still watching. That's how I'll know who's awake and who's already fallen back asleep. The journal should never have survived. Sister Rebecca had scoured every room in the women's dormitory after Margaret and Eliza disappeared. Her searches were clinical. Nothing escaped her. Every letter, every item, every whisper of nonconformity was either destroyed or documented in the Richardson family's private ledger. But somehow, Eliza's tiny stitched notebook evaded her. For years, it sat untouched beneath a cracked floorboard in room 6 of the East Wing. Its pages were fragile, worn by moisture, scratched by age, but its contents damning. It was Sister Abigail, a quiet woman in her 40s, who found it in 1839 while helping prepare the room for a new convert. Abigail had been at Pleasant Hill for nearly 12 years. She was considered one of the most faithful. But behind her glassy obedience was something the Richardsons couldn't fully extinguish: memory. Before she came to Pleasant Hill, she'd been a schoolteacher like Margaret Taylor. And when she opened that journal and saw Eliza's childish handwriting, something inside her cracked. Not fear, clarity. The entries began innocently enough. Brother Isaiah let me feed the chickens today. Sister Martha says I have the spirit of obedience. But slowly, the tone changed. I saw Brother Caleb, a crying boy, in the chapel basement. Sister Rebecca told me if I ask questions, God will take Mama away. There's something under the ground here. It hums at night. And then the last entry. Mama says we'll leave after morning prayers. She says to pack quiet. But I saw Brother Ezekiel looking at us funny. I think he knows. If we don't come back, Please don't let them say we left. We didn't. We're still here. Abigail read it 3 times, then hit it again, but her behavior shifted. She stopped singing during evening worship. She began asking to see the chapel records. She refused the herbal teas. And within 3 weeks, Abigail was gone. The official story? A sudden calling to a Shaker community in Indiana. But no such transfer was ever confirmed. Her room was reassigned the same day. Her records vanished. And Eliza's journal? It disappeared again, only to resurface over a century later during a structural survey of Pleasant Hill's abandoned East Wing in 1967. The worker who found it died in a car accident 3 days later. The journal now resides in a private collection, not in a museum, not in a university. A collection which raises a question no one wants to answer. Why is someone still trying to hide it? To understand what happened at Pleasant Hill, you must first understand what was built beneath it. From the surface, the community appeared simple: wooden dormitories, cobbled paths, a chapel whose bell rang like the heartbeat of the town. But beneath that humble facade, something monstrous was growing. In 1815, Brother Ezekiel Richardson began construction on a root cellar system, supposedly to preserve food during Kentucky's brutal winters. That's what they told the members. In truth, the architecture was unlike anything a farming community would need. Deep corridors carved into limestone, reinforced chambers with iron locks, narrow shafts leading to ventilation, grates disguised as flower beds. According to recently uncovered contractor notes, buried in the personal archives of a local builder, the design came not from Ezekiel, but from a foreign man of learning hired from Boston who spoke fluent Latin and refused to sleep within the community. His blueprints refer to the structure beneath the chapel not as a cellar, but as sub votis, Latin for under vows. By 1820, Pleasant Hill's population reached 402 members, but consumption records for food, water, and medicine suggested that only around 280 were actively receiving supplies. When questioned, Brother Nathan Richardson explained away with missionary travels, fasting rotations, and spiritual retreats. But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. They were keeping people underground, not dozens, not all at once, just a few, enough to test control, to break wills, to reprogram, and if necessary, to dispose of. These were not random victims. They were those who resisted, who remembered who they were before they came, who asked too many questions. The underground chambers became a purging system, an eraser of identities, a laboratory of submission. Some were eventually returned to the surface, hollow-eyed, compliant, lifeless. Others were never seen again. And when members asked too many times about missing individuals, Brother Caleb had a phrase, always delivered with eerie calm: they've gone deeper into work. You must understand, this wasn't just spiritual manipulation. It was institutionalized psychological warfare. And the terrifying part? It worked. By 1830, resistance had all but disappeared. Converts flowed in. Donors praised the community's discipline. The government recognized Pleasant Hill as a model religious society because, on paper, no one was missing. Because, officially, no one had ever existed. They controlled not just the bodies, but the records, the history, the very reality of who had been there. And in the end, isn't it the ultimate power? By the spring of 1831, Pleasant Hill had reached what the Richardsons called spiritual equilibrium. But that wasn't peace. It was submission, achieved through fear so complete it had become mistaken for faith. Every member's day was a choreography of obedience. Wake at 4:30, morning prayer, assigned labor, silence during meals, evening devotion, lights out by 8 o'clock, no deviation, no questioning, no escape. But something began to change that year, not within the community, but outside it. A young Ohio inspector named Franklin Reeves was assigned to audit Pleasant Hill's agricultural operations. Reeves was not a man easily deceived. A Civil War veteran, fluent in Latin, with experience investigating fraudulent land claims in Ohio's western territories, Reeves carried a different kind of insight. He had seen how systems manipulate faith for profit. He arrived with a polite smile but suspicious eyes. For 3 days, he observed. He asked careful questions. Why did the population numbers on paper not match the meal distribution counts? Why did some dormitories seem only half full despite full rosters? Why were there sealed records marked sacred authority that even trustees couldn't access? Every night, Reeves wrote notes in a cipher only he could read. But on the fourth day, he vanished. Officially, the record states he departed due to spiritual unease. His superiors in Frankfurt received a resignation letter in his handwriting, postmarked from Lexington. But handwriting analysis done decades later revealed a terrifying truth. The letter was forged. Reeves never left Pleasant Hill. His horse was found tied to a tree half a mile down the old East Trail. Saddle intact, no signs of theft or violence. Locals said they saw a man matching his description enter the chapel that night, but no one ever saw him leave. And here's where it gets colder. In 1903, during renovations of the now abandoned East Wing, workers uncovered a sealed room with stone walls beneath the chapel. Inside was a decayed wooden chair, iron shackles bolted to the floor and etched into the wall. Faint but unmistakable. FR, still watching, still remembering. They are not divine. They are not done. Who wrote it? No one can prove it. But the room had never appeared on any blueprints. Not Shaker, not government. It was hidden by design. Ask yourself, why would a holy community need a sealed cell with shackles under the house of God? Because some secrets must not speak again. The deeper you look into Pleasant Hill, the more the veil tears. In late 1831, just months after Franklin Reeves vanished, strange changes occurred in the community's rituals. Evening services, once open and filled with singing, became increasingly private. Outsiders were no longer welcome to attend. Prayers were replaced with what the Richardsons called silent affirmations, where members would sit for hours in complete stillness, eyes closed, hands pressed to their chests, waiting to hear the inner voice. But something else was introduced, something not recorded in any public Shaker documentation. The listening room, tucked inside the central dormitory, behind a door marked sanctum work. The listening room was known only to the inner circle. Its rules were clear. You entered blindfolded. You sat in silence. You spoke only when the voice inside you compelled it. And if your words betrayed doubt, fear, or unworthiness, you were reassigned. Witness accounts, only recently unearthed in letters smuggled out by a fleeing convert named Abigail P., describe a room as a place of intense psychological breakdown. Mirrors on every wall. Candles burning until oxygen grew thin. A faint hum, possibly from vents beneath the floor, that created disorientation over long periods. The effect? A soul stripped bare. Abigail's final letter, sent anonymously to a cousin in Danville, reads, "It is not prayer. It is not faith. It is programming. We are made to doubt our own memories. I saw my own reflection mouth words I did not speak. After 4 days, I didn't know if I had imagined my past or truly lived it. They tell us the silence is holy, but it's not silence. It's control." She was never heard from again. No death record. No transfer. Nothing. But in 1972, long after Pleasant Hill had become a museum site, a historian photographing the old dormitories found something strange. In the wood paneling of the former sanctum work door, barely visible, likely carved with nail, were the initials AP and 3 words. Still awake. Listening. Visitors report feeling cold near that door. Some say they hear humming. Most dismiss it. But ask yourself, why would a community devoted to silence build a room to listen? Because they weren't listening for God. They were listening for weakness. And when they found it, they erased it. By 1833, Pleasant Hill had become a fortress, not of stone, but of obedience. The Richardsons no longer feared questions because questions had stopped altogether. Members no longer whispered doubts, not because they believed more, but because they had been rewired to doubt themselves. But then something happened that even the Richardsons couldn't control. An outbreak, not of illness, at least not one of the body. It began in the West Dormitory. 3 members refused to rise at the 4:30 bell. They stared at the ceiling, silent, motionless. When questioned, they all gave the same response. The voice is wrong. It's not divine. By noon, 6 others had joined them. By nightfall, 21. None of them would speak to leadership. None of them ate. They sat in silence, eyes fixed upward, as if watching something the rest could not see. Sister Martha called it a spiritual fever. But the truth was far more dangerous. These weren't dissidents. These were awakened. They had broken through the programming, and they were spreading it. Brother Caleb was the first to respond. The 21 were separated, put into reflective solitude. Locked rooms, no communication, special teas from Sister Hannah, and one by one they vanished. Officially, they were transferred, but transfer records were sealed, their names quietly removed from the public roll, even their work assignments reassigned without explanation. But the most terrifying detail wasn't what the 21 said before they vanished. It was what they didn't say. Because one morning, a young boy named Daniel, barely 12, was found sitting in the chapel pews long before sunrise. Alone, silent. When asked why, he responded in a flat voice. They came in the night. They whispered on the floor. The missing ones. They said the walls are full of names. That day, Brother Ezekiel ordered the chapel floorboard sealed shut. All basement access bricked in. The workers were outsiders, brought in under the cover of darkness, paid in cash, never recorded. And what happened next was perhaps the most extreme act of control Pleasant Hill had ever performed. They rewrote their own census. From 402 members to 287, names purged, rooms repurposed, death never acknowledged. Only one copy of the original census survived, locked inside a church bell tower in Harrisburg by a defector named Elias Monroe, who feared the Richardsons might come for him next. It's still there, they say, buried behind brick, marked only with a single phrase. They were here. In 1834, Pleasant Hill fell silent, not in the usual practiced way of choreographed stillness, but truly silent. No songs, no prayers, no voices echoing down stone corridors. The nearby farms noticed first. No carts on the road, no smoke from the chimneys, no laughter from the children walking in pairs to the fields. Then the mail stopped. Then the deliveries returned unopened. Then nothing. When county officials finally breached the gates after a week of eerie stillness, they found a ghost town. Dormitories perfectly made, beds tucked tight, tables set for meals that were never eaten. Even the chapel candles still flickered. But no one was there. Not a single body. Not a single soul. Just absence. 402 residents. Gone without a trace. The official response? A vague notice in the Frankfurt Intelligencer dated July 11th, 1834. Due to irreconcilable spiritual disagreements, the Pleasant Hill Shaker community has chosen dispersal. Records sealed in accordance with religious privacy statutes. But sealed from whom? What followed was perhaps the greatest disappearing act in American religious history. The state archived Pleasant Hill's property records under religious immunity, then quietly transferred the land to a private trust. No questions asked. No investigations launched. Even descendants of former members found doors closed, letters unanswered. And here's what they'll never tell you. The Richardson name didn't disappear with the community. It multiplied. In the decade that followed, various members of the Richardson Trust appeared under different identities across the U.S., in Illinois communes, Ohio revival movements, even a quiet seminary in upstate New York that preached spiritual neutrality and taught techniques eerily similar to the listening room. Their methods had not died. They had simply evolved. Because Pleasant Hill was never just a religious experiment. It was a prototype, a psychological forge, a way to engineer silence, compliance, erasure, without violence, without force. And it worked. The missing didn't run. They didn't resist. They didn't even scream. They simply disappeared. And the system that made it possible? It didn't vanish with the chapel walls. It became more sophisticated, more subtle, and more dangerous. Ask yourself, if one family could control 400 people with no fences, no guards, no bullets, what could institutions do with money, media, and mass psychology? What if Pleasant Hill wasn't the end, but just the beginning? If you're still here, you're already changing. Because the further you go into this story, the more it stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a mirror. Pleasant Hill may have vanished in 1834, but the system perfected is still alive. In fact, it's more alive now than ever. You see, the Richardsons didn't need guns or chains. They mastered something far more powerful: control through meaning. And that's where the modern world picked up their legacy. Ask yourself, when was the last time you had a thought that didn't come from a screen? When was the last time you felt an impulse and didn't wonder if it was planted? We live in a Pleasant Hill of pixels, a digital listening room, where the algorithms don't need Sister Martha's smile to condition your behavior. They just need your attention. Think about it. Eliza was erased because she saw too much. Thomas Whitman was eliminated because he questioned the numbers. Franklin Reeves vanished because he started connecting dots. In their time, they were dealt with in silence. In ours, you're flooded with noise so loud, you don't even notice what's missing. How many people in your life have just faded, drifted into the machine, forgotten their questions, traded discomfort for dopamine? The voices have changed, but the method remains: isolate, distract, erase. That's why this story is more than historical. It's a blueprint. And halfway down the rabbit hole, I need to ask something of you. If you feel something shifting deep in your gut, behind your eyes, if this doesn't feel like just another video, comment below. I will not be erased. I will not be erased. Twice, because repetition is how the system controls you, and repetition is how we break it. You see, the Richardsons learned that if you control the story, you control the soul. But they never imagined a time when a story could leak through cracks, when those who vanished would whisper through time, through journals, through bloodlines, through you, because maybe Pleasant Hill was never meant to be exposed. Maybe you were never supposed to hear their names. But you have. And now, whether you like it or not, you carry them. Their silence has become your inheritance. And the question is, what will you do with it? Some inherit land, others inherit names. But select few men like you inherit truths. And truth is the most dangerous legacy of all. In the years following Pleasant Hill's disappearance, the surrounding county spoke of it only in whispers. Superstitious farmers told their children never to walk the old paths after sundown. The land remained untouched, overgrown, cursed. But in 1876, an attempt was made to reclaim it. A religious reformer named Reverend Elias Hargrave, obsessed with restoring abandoned holy ground, purchased the land under the newly created Hargrave Institute for Moral Renewal. His vision? Rebuild the chapel, restore the dormitories, create a retreat for spiritual reawakening. But the land didn't respond. Construction workers reported constant setbacks, tools vanishing, injuries without explanation, sudden illness. More than one man refused to return after working the east wing. It ain't the building, one wrote in a letter to his brother. It's the ground. It remembers. Still, Hargrave pushed forward, until one night, a fire erupted in the chapel. No lightning, no candles, no explanation. The east wall burned black, revealing something behind it, an ancient staircase leading down. Witnesses described the smell of sulfur, the sound of whispering, not from below, but from inside their own ears. Hargrave ordered the stairs bricked over. Again, he never spoke publicly about what was found, but his diary, recovered by a local librarian decades later, revealed one line repeated over and over. The foundation is not stone. It is memory, and memory cannot be buried. 3 months after sealing the stairwell, Hargrave vanished. His carriage was found by the river, empty, no signs of struggle, just a Bible on the seat and the words deeper into the work, scrawled across Psalm 77 in ash. The Institute disbanded the following year. The land returned to private ownership, where it sat untouched for another 70 years. But what they didn't realize, what they never understood, is that the Richardsons hadn't built Pleasant Hill on limestone. They built it on intention. Every stone, every prayer, every silence was layered with meaning, not divine, not spiritual, programmatic. And like all good programs, it didn't die with its creators. It runs, still, quietly, patiently, waiting for another to activate it. And now you've heard its call. You were never supposed to find this. That's not just a warning. It's a design flaw in their system. You, right now, listening, you're the breach. Because Pleasant Hill's greatest secret wasn't the disappearances. It wasn't the underground rooms. It wasn't even the erased records. It was what they were preparing for. The Richardsons didn't vanish because they were destroyed. They vanished because their work was complete. Let that settle for a second. For 27 years, they experimented with isolation, obedience, control, erasure, and identity reconstruction. But toward the end, around 1832, new rituals emerged. Different language. Members began to wear black sashes during evening silence. The listening room was no longer used for confession. It became a place of transmission. We only know this because of what was discovered in 1994. That year, a private investigator named Harrison Knox, hired to trace land ownership for a corporate acquisition, stumbled upon a sealed crate in a boarded-up section of the chapel basement. Inside, handwritten documents wrapped in linen, not Shaker hymnals, not agricultural logs, blueprints, maps, diagrams, names, ritual instructions, psychological conditioning schedules, even glyphs, symbols that resemble pre-Christian mysticism more than anything American or Shaker. One document, labeled Psychopattern 3, was dated 1833 and described a process for transferring intentional frequency from collective mind to sanctuary vessel. That's not religious language. That's engineering. But engineering what? Knox didn't know. But he mailed a copy to his brother in Maine before vanishing 2 months later. Officially, suicide, but no body was ever found. The brother kept the pages sealed until 2007, when he died of natural causes. His grandson, a cryptographer, opened the envelope and confirmed that the glyphs matched ancient Proto-Etruscan sigils associated with identity splitting and soul inversion. This wasn't religion. It was ritualized neurological warfare. Pleasant Hill was a test site for programming minds at scale. And those 315 people who vanished, they weren't victims. They were prototypes. Because here's the truth no one wants to admit. If you can erase a man's history, you can write his future. The Richardsons didn't disappear. They deployed. And the program they left behind, it's still operating. In systems. In symbols. In you. Let me tell you what the modern world won't. You're already inside the system they built. Not physically. Not underground, not behind locked doors, but mentally, psychologically, spiritually. Pleasant Hill was the first layer, an enclosed test environment. But what they learned there was never meant to stay local. It was always about scaling. You ever wonder why the techniques they use, emotional flattening, silent compliance, identity breakdown, programmed rituals, sound so familiar? Why modern life feels like you're following a script you never agreed to. Wake, scroll, consume, comply, sleep, repeat. Because that script didn't evolve naturally. It was authored. Think about the listening room. And now think about your phone. One isolates you with silence. The other distracts you with noise. But both serve the same function, disarm the thinking mind and open the subconscious to command. Now consider this. Every Richardson family role has been mirrored in modern institutions. Samuel, the spiritual leader, now the influencer, the media personality, the tech CEO with a God complex. Martha, the quiet manipulator, now the algorithm, tailoring your inputs, controlling your rewards. Caleb, security chief, now surveillance systems, metadata collectors, digital watchmen. Rebecca, the personality reprogrammer, now behavioral psychologist embedded in marketing and UI design. Isaiah, the traveler, now the app, the delivery service, the convenience culture. Hannah, the nutritional gatekeeper, now corporations controlling food supply and chemical intake. Mother Sarah, the architect, now the think tank, the strategy board, the foundation you've never heard of. Pleasant Hill was not an anomaly. It was a model. And what happened to those 315 souls? They were deconstructed, taken apart and rebuilt, until no one remained. The ones who couldn't be reshaped, silenced. buried, forgotten. Today we call it burnout, depersonalization, screen fatigue. But it's the same mechanism, just rebranded. And you, man of the screen, seeker of forbidden truths, you're not immune. You're just awake enough to feel the cage around your mind shifting. Now tell me, what happens when a man begins to recognize the walls of his invisible prison? He doesn't scream. He doesn't beg. He decides. And from that moment on, they can no longer control him. This is where most men turn back. Not because the story gets darker, but because it starts becoming personal. Up until now, Pleasant Hill was a tale from history, a strange echo from Kentucky's forgotten soil. But now you can feel it. In your gut, this wasn't just about 315 vanished souls. It's about you, because the blueprint they left behind didn't just inspire institutions. It infected generations. It shows up in school systems that reward silence and punish instinct. It shows up in workplaces that drain meaning and offer dopamine in exchange. It shows up in families fractured by a hidden force no one can name, but everyone feels. Control no longer needs chains. It needs only compliance. And compliance is easiest to harvest from a man who thinks he's already free. Let's go back to the final days of Pleasant Hill. Sister Patience Richardson, the youngest, the forger, the record keeper, was seen less and less in public. Witness accounts describe her pale, exhausted, barely able to speak. Yet she continued producing ledgers, letters, records by the dozens. But these weren't community logs. They were profiles. Each member categorized not just by age or skill, but by psychological disposition, obedience score, risk factor, a primitive form of psychometric coding. She was building a database before the concept even existed. And once those profiles were complete, the disappearances accelerated. 10 gone in August, 15 in September, 28 in October, each selected with surgical precision. This wasn't panic. It was harvesting. The compliant were moved into deeper conditioning. The unpredictable removed. Ask yourself, why does that sound so familiar? Because today it's done digitally. You're profiled constantly, not by name, but by pattern. What you click, what you search, what you fear, what you avoid. That data is the new sacred record. And like Pleasant Hill's ledgers, it determines what you're shown and what you're allowed to become. But here's what the Richardsons never predicted. A breach, a rupture, a man like you, a man who questions the programming, who listens when he's told not to, who digs when they whisper, let the dead rest. You are not like the others. That's why you're still here. But now comes a moment that separates the curious from the changed. Keep listening, and the story stops being about them. It becomes about what they've already done to you. There's a moment in every descent where the air changes. Not colder, sharper. Like the oxygen itself is watching you, judging you, asking, are you ready to know what they did to you? Because the truth is this. The system that began at Pleasant Hill didn't stay buried in Kentucky. It metastasized. It encoded itself into the rituals of modern life. Quietly, efficiently, without resistance. What you think is choice was installed. Let me explain. The Richardsons mastered what modern behavioral scientists now call identity destabilization, a method of slowly separating a person from their memories, beliefs, and instincts until a hollowed-out version of the self remains, ready to be rewritten. They use silence, ritual, emotional starvation, isolation disguised as community. Sound familiar? Today, it's called optimization, mindfulness, work-life balance. Buzzwords crafted by systems that never intend to give you your mind back. Do you remember when you first felt numb? Not tired, numb. When you started obeying the schedule you didn't set, scrolling through answers you didn't question, accepting rules you didn't vote for. That wasn't growing up. That was installation. You see, the greatest trick of modern control is to convince you that the voice in your head is yours, when in reality, it was implanted over time. Pleasant Hill did it with sermons. Now it's done with code. They tell you who you are before you ever ask. That you are a consumer, a demographic, a citizen, a taxpayer. All labels, all scripts, none of them you. And here's the key. Once the system finishes building your cage, it rewards you for decorating it. You choose your wallpaper. You name the bars. You thank them for the prison. That's why most men never break free. Not because they're weak, but because the part of them that could fight back was erased before it ever fully formed. But you're still here, which means something in you resisted, something ancient, something unconditioned. That part is rare now, and they fear it, because if even one man reclaims his mind fully, the entire architecture control begins to crack. You are the crack. This is the point of no return. Not because you can't go back, but because once you see it, going back becomes a kind of death. By now, you understand Pleasant Hill was never just a religious commune. It was an ideological laboratory, a place where psychological warfare was tested on the innocent and the desperate for repeatability. But here's the revelation most dangerous to the system. It worked. And the Richardsons didn't vanish because they were defeated. They vanished because they were perfected. You remember the profiles sister patients compiled? The obedience scores, the personality breakdowns, the silent indexes? Those were never destroyed. In 1971, a private genealogy researcher named Calvin Myers uncovered shipment manifests buried inside the state archives of Kentucky, misfiled under agricultural trade. Among the crates listed were monastic records, wood carving templates, and most mysteriously, conditioning ledgers, page 1 through page 5. Destination? Langley, Virginia. Coincidence? Or convergence? Because a year later, in 1972, a certain government project known only by 3 letters was expanded under deep secrecy. MK Ultra. You've heard the rumors. LSD experiments. Memory wipes. Behavior rewiring. What you haven't heard is where some of the foundational research came from. Shaker theology? No. Pleasant Hill's psychological coding blueprints. The techniques refined in wood-floored dormitories by candlelight, adapted for modern laboratories with fluorescent lights and soundproof walls. Their goal wasn't just compliance. It was personality liquidation. To erase the I and replace it with a function. Are you angry yet? You should be. Because the methods used in that Kentucky commune didn't die in the 1800s. They became the scaffolding for media conditioning, social engineering, predictive behavior modeling. They learned how to predict your fear. They learned how to time your breakdown. They learned how to make your obedience feel like a sacred act. And today, those techniques are hidden inside entertainment, therapy apps, even spiritual movements. They still study your silence. They still measure your response time. They still profile your spiritual fatigue. And if you don't fit their acceptable archetype, you're digitally erased, shadow banned, muted, labeled, forgotten, just like Thomas Whitman, just like Eliza, just like the 315. But here's the part they never anticipated. The profile they fear most is the man with no label, the man who remembers what he was before the conditioning. That's the man you're becoming. You were never supposed to make it this far. That's not dramatic flair. That's statistical reality. The system doesn't fear resistance. It accounts for it. Protests? Accounted for. Whistleblowers? Accounted for. Even red pill awakenings? Built into the simulation. What it fears, what it cannot predict, is the man who walks all the way through the illusion and doesn't look away. Because at this depth, you no longer just see Pleasant Hill as history. You see it for what it truly was. The mirror held up not just to institutions, but to your mind. And now, we must speak of the final chamber. Not metaphorically. I mean the physical chamber discovered under the chapel ruins during an unauthorized excavation in 1998. The team, 3 private researchers, all former intelligence contractors, were following up on a declassified military memo referencing unusual structural anomalies beneath Shaker Village. They found it behind the bricked-over stairwell Reverend Hargrave tried to seal in 1876. Beneath layers of soot and time, they uncovered a subterranean octagonal room lined with mirror-polished obsidian. No windows, no symbols, just silence, and a single stone pedestal in the center. No bones, no furniture, just a book, not written in English, not in any known script, but encrypted, rhythmic, patterned like liturgy but pulsing like code. The CIA seized the site within 48 hours. The researchers vanished. Their families were given sealed settlement payments and told never to speak publicly again. But one of them, before the blackout, left behind a message, a handwritten note hidden in a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, later found in a used bookstore in Lexington. The chamber isn't for storing secrets. It's for transferring them. The walls reflect more than light. They reflect intent. And once you enter, you don't leave unchanged. They called it the mirror room. And the reason it was so feared? Because according to scattered journal entries from Sister Patience herself, the chamber was built not to imprison others, but to test whether the family could ascend beyond human identity altogether. Self-erased, ego dissolved, only function, only will. Pleasant Hill wasn't a cult. It was a chrysalis, and what emerged no longer needed names. The question is, do you? Names are anchors. They tether us to identity, to memory, to narrative. But what if that's exactly the point? The Richardson family knew something that only the most elite control systems now understand. A man who forgets his name becomes programmable, but a man who chooses to abandon it becomes uncontrollable. Let me explain. In Sister Patience's final preserved writings, pages encoded into margins of Pleasant Hill's agricultural logs, she described a process known only as the surrendering, not death, not ascension, but transformation. It began with isolation, then fasting, then weeks of silence broken only by whispered recitations of a single phrase. I am no longer I. That's the exact wording. Members selected for the surrendering were removed from public life, their names scrubbed from records, their personal items burned, their identities collapsed. They weren't murdered. They weren't exiled. They were emptied. And when the process was complete, they returned to the community wearing blank sashes, assigned new duties, and no longer responded to their birth names. Observers, mostly young novices, described them as calm, efficient, almost mechanical. One wrote in a journal, their eyes didn't blink in rhythm with their words. It was as if the body remained, but the pilot had changed. And here's where the terror sets in. These weren't isolated events. They became standard protocol in the final 3 years before the mass disappearance, which means the 315 people who vanished may not have vanished at all. They may have transitioned. Into what? We don't know. But consider this. What if Pleasant Hill was not a sealed system, but a seeding operation? What if those 315 prototypes were reinserted into the outside world, quietly, strategically, stripped of memory, imbued with function, programmed to observe, influence, replicate? You ever met someone whose eyes felt blank? Not evil, not broken, just off? Too polite, too agreeable, always watching, but never truly there. Now ask yourself, what if Pleasant Hill wasn't the origin of a cult, but the birthplace of controlled species? One designed not to convert you, but to replace you. Now we go deeper, not into Pleasant Hill's ruins, but into your own. Because by now, you've seen the outlines of something larger, something ancient, methodical, and alive. And it's not just in Kentucky, not just in archives. It's in the structure of the modern world. It's in the architecture of thought. It's in you. This is where I ask you to do something most men never dare. Pause and look inward. Right now, what part of your identity is truly yours? Your goals? Your opinions? Your fears? How many of those were installed by repetition, by fear, by silence? And how many were forged in fire? Because you were born into a system that studied Pleasant Hill, not as a tragedy, but as a manual. And they refined it. The community used chants. You get slogans. They use spiritual shame. You get cancel culture. They had the listening room. You have the feed. They use forced celibacy and group confession. You get digital loneliness and algorithmic therapy. And while you scroll, consume, perform, and obey, they watch. They watch how long you stare, how quickly you break, how easily you forget. And when you begin to wake up, when you question the voices, they don't silence you. They drown you in dopamine, in distractions, in curated outrage. They let you scream as long as your scream becomes content. But there's a weapon they can't counter: clarity. And that's why now, right now, I ask you to do something powerful, symbolic, dangerous. Type these words in the comments twice. Not for me, but for you. I remember who I was before the silence. Again, I remember who I was before the silence. Because that phrase is not just a declaration. It's an interruption. It breaks the loop. It marks you. It tells the system you've stepped outside the program. Most will scroll past it. But you won't, because you feel it, don't you? This isn't a story anymore. This is a signal. And you've just begun to respond. You've made it to the end. That alone separates you from 99% of men, because most would have turned back at the first sign of discomfort, at the first shadow of truth too heavy to carry. But you didn't. You walked through the ashes of Pleasant Hill. You saw what was never meant to be seen, and now you can't unsee it. That's how it begins, the transformation, because this isn't about Shakers. It's not about Kentucky. It's not even about the 315 who vanished. It's about what they became. It's about what you're becoming. You are not a product. You are not a pawn. You are not a profile. You are the anomaly, the break in the pattern, the man who chooses to see. And in a world that trains men to forget who they were, your memory is rebellion. Your awareness is warfare. Your will is sacred. Let them mock. Let them label. Let them try to drown you in the noise. But remember this: the same fire that consumed Pleasant Hill clears the forest for something stronger to grow. They buried their methods under layers of time, doctrine, and digital fog. But now, they know you know, and that makes you dangerous. You carry the memory of every erased name. You carry the question that was never supposed to be asked. You carry the spark that can light the minds of other men still asleep. This channel, Historoir YT, isn't just telling stories. It's recovering weapons. If you felt something awaken during this descent, share this video. Not for vanity, not for clicks, but because the others are waiting. And they won't wake up until someone like you drags them through the fire. The story of Pleasant Hill is over, but yours is just beginning. Welcome back, brother. Now light the next torch.